Hello, how are you? Trevor Gordon Hall here. Good to see you back. Maybe you're tuning in for the first time for this course. It's week number 2, so don't worry if you missed last week. We're here at the Guitar Gym for Rookies, and the entire concept in a very brief synopsis was from the Rocky movies. When Rocky in Rocky 1, when Rocky says to Mickey, you got to train me, you know. And Mickey says, you got the heart, kid, but you ain't got the tools. So it's really important when thinking about going to the guitar gym, as we're doing here, to think, training is about strength and stamina, but it's also about smarts, right? So we want to find what is the really key kernel in all of these different aspects of guitar playing that will really, really help. Not just repetition, but making sure you're doing proper repetition and making sure you're practicing the right things. So last week we talked about playing chords and just getting a handle on bar chords and some of those chords that just give you a whole lot of grief and how to practice them. We talked about sort of getting used to the shape of the chords before you hop to the next chord. So you're not constantly just searching one finger at a time, next finger, next finger, next finger. You're starting to get the idea of a whole block. There's sort of an image that's in the chord. So when you get to the next chord, you're sort of almost already in place, getting ready to play that. This week, I want to talk about playing chord progressions, so putting them together. And just talk about what's happening in a chord progression. There are different families of chords that work really well together. And you'll notice as we go through a couple of these, you'll say, I never knew that, but I know that sounds familiar. I've heard that in a lot of different songs. The main thing in here is to make sure that you're starting to recognize the patterns, that there are different chord progressions that are used pretty commonly. And then we're going to talk about things that can make sort of unexpected, sense of resolution, but also if we take what a chord should be major and we turn it to minor or go the other way, that makes this really interesting dimension to the chord progressions. And that's the stuff that you'll hear in the Beatles and the Beach Boys did it all the time. Radiohead does it. It's just a cool thing to be aware of so that when you're training, when you're practicing your songs, you have these in your mind. You start looking for the patterns. So again, you're not just mere repetition. We're not just punching the bag. We're looking at the different angles so that when you get to punching the bag, you got the technique, you got the skills, you got the tools, as Mickey says. So without further ado, I'm going to hop right into exercise 1. And what we're going to do is just going to practice a little bit, and then I want to break down exercise 1 and 2. Then we want to break down what's happening. So I won't talk too much. Let's get right to some training, and then we'll zoom out and get to more of the teaching of what's really inside each of these progressions. So give a nice warm welcome to Mr. Jason from Jam Play. Say hi, Jason. Hello. If he would kindly put up the exercises here, playing chord progressions. In exercise 1, last week we talked about with bar chords. Sometimes, when I first started, I would always avoid playing bar chords because they felt really difficult to play. And I would avoid them by going to other chords that I would maybe have to stretch to, or I would try to find some open strings that were ringing out so I could avoid a bar chord. And I remember early on, because I didn't want to play this A bar chord on the 5th fret, I remember just bailing on the whole bar right here, and I just lifted, and I was like, whoa, that's really cool. So my initial detest of bar chords opened up a new opportunity, which was kind of interesting. So I want to talk about a couple of these chords just to get you started here. We'll practice these together that use the open string so you don't have to do the bars. But now that we've made peace with bar chords from our last lesson, don't be afraid to play the bars as well. So I will stop talking and let's start playing. Well, I have to talk to teach the concept here. Number one. So look at exercise 1. We have E major. And this is a really common chord. Everybody's learned to play this. What you want to do when you play this chord is, again, just make sure that you're on the fingertips, right? The very tips of your fingers. So if you have anything that's sort of wobbly, like on the fretboard here, just make sure you go to the fingertip and then go as close to the edge of the fret as you can get. And that allows you to get a really good sound there. All right, so that's the first chord. The second chord is going to go all the way up here. We're going to go to an A. This will be kind of an A suspended, but you put your first finger on the 5th fret of the low E. You put your third finger on the 7th fret of the A, and then you have the D string, and then you have G sharp here. All right? So sometimes with these chords, you can actually reform the E to back down here. So you could do your 2nd, your 3rd, and your 4th. And that just makes it a little bit easier when you hop up to this. And you'll notice as I'm going from this shape, we talked about last week, I'm not resetting the fingers and then finding a new shape. I'm sort of keeping them in the general area where they will be on the next chord, right? And then the next chord from here is going to go to a B, and we move this identical one all the way up here to the 7th fret. All right? And then from there, we're going to go back to E where we started. So again, you have the option of doing a 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, or your 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So just play what's comfortable. So what I want to do is play through this, and I'm going to do it right here on my handy-dandy little, it's at 60 beats per minute. It's a little hard to see the display, but trust me, it's at 60. So when I'll just count it off, and then we'll start playing this together. Start with E. 1, 2, ready, go. Last time. Excellent. So now we've done that. It's really nice to find, when you're practicing, to find things that are really nice and pleasing to play. And that's one of those chord progressions that will really go a long way when you're practicing it, not only for you, but for the people listening to you practice. It's very, very important. So now, after we've seen that in exercise 1, we're going to jump to another key, and we're going to do a very similar progression. And we're going to dissect what I mean by that. Where do these tendencies come from? Where do these progressions come from? And how can you tell one from another? And to start looking at and listening for, in your favorite songs, these patterns starting to pop up. Once you start doing that, and I know this for me, when I started to realize how progressions were working in the different formulas, I just started hearing it everywhere, and that became really exciting. Okay, so in number 2, what you want to do, we're going to hop to the key of D, all right? So what you want to do is take your first finger, and we're just going to make a colorful version of a D major. In this one, what's really nice about this is it's a bar, but it's only a partial bar, which means that you don't have to bar across all of the frets. So go ahead, and what you want to do is take your first finger, put it on the G on the 2nd fret, and then you have the B string and then the E. And what you want to do is get that D string open, right? When we're strumming these, you want to just make sure that you could probably hit this low E. It's going to muddy the chord just a little bit. So this is a situation where you just want to sort of aim the pick, or if you're strumming with your thumb or your index finger, just sort of aim for the top part of the strings there. And the reason I throw this in is because I think it's important that in any chord that you already know, start shopping for local notes to add some color. So for instance, if you start with a D chord like this, a very common way to add some color to this is to just lift up your middle, right? Or you can sort of put the pinky down right here. And that's a very common sound. But what's really nice is to actually take this note, instead of adjusting something on the high E, let's adjust something on the B string. All that means is we arrive at this, which is just a really nice chord to listen to, which means it's a really nice chord to practice. So we're going to go from this is called a D major 7. Then we're going to go from there to a G major. So that's easy, we know this one. So put your second finger, first finger, then you have these two open all the way up here. Now, if you'll notice, if you'll come across a lot of different versions of a G major, and that's okay. All of them are spelling a relatively same, the ingredients are still adding up to G. It's still a G major, but maybe you'll see it written this way, right? Or maybe with like the pinky up here. You know, there's a couple different ways to play it, so find a G that's comfortable for you. I tend to like this one. Then the next chord after that is an A chord. And with the A, we had some questions about this last week when playing sometimes with an A7 or playing an A. If you actually use your first finger, right? Sometimes with some people's fingers, they can bend them a little bit more. So just to review, when we talked about last week, it's totally fine if you want to do that. Just be aware of if your finger is not letting you sort of clear that high E string. Just be aware that maybe your finger doesn't go back that far, and you just have to find a different way to do the same chord. There are different ways to do it. I learned index, middle, and ring, right? In this case, and a lot of times these days, if I'm going to play this chord, I'll tend to go second, third, and fourth. It just feels a little bit more comfortable. And when you go up to a bar chord, you're kind of already in position for that. So anyway, so yeah, we have our D major 7. We go to a G, and then the next one is an A. And then we're going to end with a D major. All right? So from D major 7 to G to A to D. This is also a very common sound, and we'll talk about why in just a second. So we're going to try this now. Jason, if you want to put that up. So exercise 2, right? We're going to start with D major 7. We're going to do this at 60 beats per minute. And one thing that I'll say is when you're playing through these chords, they may feel fairly easy, and that's okay. You can use this as a warm-up. They may feel a little bit like a struggle, and that's fine. One thing that's helpful is to make sure you keep strumming even if you don't have the chord. The reason why is sometimes when you're getting from chord to chord, if you take a break and re-find the next chord, then take another break and re-find the next chord, you start training your muscle memory to expect those breaks, right? When you're wanting to get a chord really clean and clear, it's a good thing to do that. You want to make sure that testing to make sure there's any buzzing notes, and then just problem solving to make sure you know what's happening down here. But when we're strumming and really get a handle on going from chord to chord, sometimes it's really great to keep this going no matter what. And this is sort of like the general that keeps all the troops in order over on this side, right? Instead of them saying, hold on, I'm not at the chord yet, back off, give me some time. This one's like, I don't care, we're going with or without you. And what's great about that is it actually forces the fingers to get into place a little bit quicker. So you'll feel a panic the first few times you do it, and then it gets a little bit easier. So embrace that panic feeling because it's them just training to know where the right notes are on the next chord. And all of that, of course, gets taken care of once we get used to using the chords as like one single block. But anyway, let's go 60 beats per minute now on exercise 2. Here we go, D major 7 to start. 1, 2, ready, go. D major 7, G, get ready for A, D, again D major 7, D major 7, A, D. One more time. Excellent. Okay, so basically, what's happening here is that we're playing a 1-4-5-1 progression. What does that mean? It's really important to get an idea of some of this terminology, because a lot of times if you sit down and you're jamming with friends and they'll say, hey, let's do a 1-4-5 in G, and you don't know exactly what to do. It's just sort of certain music theory lingo for a specific concept. And when we just played this, these are very familiar sounds to guitar players. So a lot of times when you hear a music theory concept, a lot of times we can just sort of blank out as guitar players or get really overwhelmed. But as you can tell, these are familiar sounds. So all we have to do now is sort of attach the music theory terminology to the already familiar sound. And a lot of times that really helps a fruitful relationship between the guitar player and theory, right? The smarts and the technique, right? That's very important. So let's, before we do that, let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll hop right into dissecting the progression here. How can you tell the difference on the notation if it's a bar chord or open string? Good question. So basically, if it's going to be a bar chord, is it on this specific notation here, if it says a 0, it's going to be an open string. Otherwise, so for instance, if I go up to exercise 1, there's going to be, in the second measure, when on the A, it says 5, 7, 7, 6, and then it says 0, 0. So that's just telling me I have to make sure I grab all of these frets, but I have to make sure that these top two are open. So if I said, if it had on the tab there the 5, 7, 7, 6, and then 5, 5, then you know that it'll be a bar chord. Now, a lot of times they'll actually have it written as a Roman numeral, or sometimes it'll say a bar above it that'll say like the position of the guitar, will say like 5th position or something like that. So you might see that sometimes. But yeah, most of the time, if you're looking directly just at the tab, if you don't see anything with a 0, then you know it's going to be a bar or a fully formed chord and no open strings. Question: I have large fingers and problems with crowding. What exercises do you recommend to help to be accurate? That's a really, really good question. The first thing I would say is, because that can cause quite a lot of panic, especially if you see other players feeling comfortable, especially on that A, right? When you have all these fingers sort of crowded into one fret, like, how's this going to happen? Number one is just knowing that different guitars will have a different thickness of the neck. So if you're playing an electric guitar, that's typically going to be a thinner neck, which means that you're not going to have to reach as far up to get some of these, to get to the low E string or the high E string. So that's good. But the downside of that is that means everything else is crowded. So sometimes I've found that when I was first starting, I started on this acoustic guitar that had strings, like an inch away from the fretboard. And so the action was really high. It was also a really thin, it was just really thin neck. So I sort of I didn't know any better. I just thought that's the way it was. And so I practiced and practiced to try to get my chords as clean as I possibly could. And then I had a neighbor friend who got this brand new electric guitar, and I tried a couple of chords on his guitar, and they sounded perfect. So not all the time, but sometimes just changing the instrument can really help that crowded feeling, because it may just be the guitar, right? But if you have, like if you feel like the fingers are still kind of getting a little bit more crowded, the number one thing I would say is make sure that you have your thumb not hanging up on this region, right? You want to keep your thumb back behind the neck and point it up with wherever your middle finger goes. And the reason why I say that is because if I look at this angle right here, if I'm going all the way like this and I'm trying to grab this A chord, this position really forces sort of the side of the finger to press the notes, right? And if I just do the side of the finger to press those notes, I'm always going to bleed, I'm always going to get, some of the surface of the skin into the area of the next string. And then you're going to get sort of that buzzy type sound. So I always recommend, make sure you put your thumb back. You can keep it sort of in a middle point on the back of the neck. And then make sure you get on the very tip of your finger. Now, everyone's hands are built a little bit differently. So here's a case where if you can't play that chord and it feels like, man, every time I go for this crowded one, that's okay. Find a version of A that you like to listen to, that's pleasant, and that makes it a little bit easier to play. So maybe now your A will become this, right? There'll be some cases where it might not necessarily work, but for the most part, you can find versions of chords if one of them is difficult to play. Find another way of playing that chord. You can sort of look for local notes or go to like a bar chord version. And a lot of times that can really help the frustration as well. So if you're getting stuck on one specific chord, go through what we talked about, but also know there are other ways to play that chord that may suit your fingers a little bit better. And that's A-okay. All right. The next question here, what exercises did you use to help with playing and reading the notation at the same time? I have a hard time doing both. That's a really, really good question. As guitar players, when we see a sheet of music, standard notation in front of us, there can be that kind of like, what am I looking at? Whereas with piano players, it can be very easy. Flute players, trumpet, they're just sort of used to looking at notation and sort of reading and understanding music that way. When it comes to guitar, we're very shape driven and we're also very ear driven. Okay, so when we see something on the page, sometimes it takes a retranslation to get back to, it's that sound, right? We talked about just a little bit ago, a 1-4-5-1 progression. If I said, okay, what's a 1-4-5-1 progression, and you don't know, but you heard, okay, that sounds familiar, you got it, right? So that's one thing. Just be aware that sometimes we just have to connect a complex idea just to something that we already are familiar with our ears. But the most important thing is to get Guitar Pro, the software Guitar Pro. And what I did for years is anytime I was learning a piece, anytime I was composing a piece, I would just put, even if it's just a measure or just two measures, a whole bar, you don't have to do a whole piece, or you can break off little chunks at a time. Get Guitar Pro, and the reason why is because you can input the tab, and it will show you what the notation is, so you can see it on both bars, and you can also hit your space bar and press play. So you can see, a 16th note sounds that quick, or a 16th note sounds like this. You can hear it, you can visually see it in both, and I think that's a really effective way because as guitar players, we are visual, but we're very, very ear-driven. So that's a really good way. And I found that sometimes reading complex rhythms or some wacky chord changes can really, really help. You can sit and solve by just going, one note at a time, and that's good too. But think about using Guitar Pro not just as a way to get tabs, but as a way to learn standard notation on your own, right? So just take, sometimes you can look up like a lead sheet from from a Beatles tune, from whatever, and you can just literally input it into Guitar Pro and just make that a project one day. Sit down in the afternoon, and you'll see what's great about it is if you go a couple of notes extra in the bar, the whole bar turns red, which is telling you there's too many notes. So there's kind of some fail-safe. It's saying, okay, if this is in 4/4, I have 6 beats in here, so now I have to put a beat in the next measure, right? So don't feel bad. Don't feel at all lost. It's just unfamiliar. That's it. You're unfamiliar with it. Guitar Pro is a really, really effective way to line up the notation, the tab, and the hearing all at the same time. All right, so we'll take some more questions, so make sure you keep those coming. What I want to talk about is, Jason, if you want to put up this crazy looking sheet here has a whole bunch of sharps on it. This is one of these really, really wacky looking sheets. And this is not meant to be, you'll have this thing sort of memorized, right? But the idea here is that this is a reference. So when you have the encyclopedia on your bookshelf next to your little globe and the things you buy at the airport before you leave. And it's kind of one of those things that when you need to, you go reference it, you look at it. But you don't sit down and just read and memorize, This is one of those sheets where, as we get into talking now about how progressions are built and where chords and keys come from, this is one of those things you can print out. You can just have it on your wall so that if somebody says, what's a 1-4-5 in A, or what's a 1-5-6-4, this is how you tell that. So let's look at the sheet real quick. Along the very top, it says whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. What that is explaining is just the distance between two notes in a major scale. And a major scale is obviously our do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. I'm not teaching voice lessons here. I'm not going to sing that again. But do, a dear. Anyway, so our standard do, re, mi scale that we hear in so many different tunes, it's very familiar. That's what all of this is really built on. So a lot of Western music, a lot of music that's most familiar to us, is going to have that sequence of notes. But what does that mean? That means if you look at there's the Roman numerals on here, but right underneath that it says C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That means that the distance on our fretboard between C and D is a whole step. Between D and E is a whole step. Between E and F is a half step. Between F and G is a whole, G and A, whole, A, B, whole, and then a half step between B and our root again at C. So this is just sort of a quick reference for our sharp keys. Then what this is saying right here, when you have, it'll have a Roman numeral and it'll say root, second, third. So that's just the very first note of the scale is going to be a root. That's called a root note. The second note's going to be the second, the third, and it goes all the way from there. And the root, sometimes it's called an eighth, but most of the time you just arrive at 8 again. But what's interesting is that each of these, there's a major and a minor chord in these. The major is capitalized and the minor is going to be lowercase. So for instance, our 1 chord, if you look at that sheet, that 1 chord, it's got a capital, Roman numeral. And then you'll see 2, that means minor, right? Because it's in lowercase. Then we have 3, which is minor. Then you have the 4 chord, which is major. The 5 chord, which is major. The 6 chord, which is major. And the 7th chord is a diminished. And so you don't have to know too much about that, except this sheet is sort of doing a lot of that thinking for you, all right? I do have a course here that I recorded with Jamplay that's going to be coming out sometime soon. We recorded it in March. That really goes into detail on how chords are formed into triads and all the different inversions you can play, and really going a deep dive into chords. This is sort of like a summary sheet that will help you, all right? So be on the lookout for that if you're interested in diving into that a little bit more. But now that we have what kinds of chords are in each key, and we have each of these keys down here, now we can start looking at a very easy reference. So let's go back to exercise 1. We started with E major, and then we went to A major, we went to B, and then back to E. So go ahead and find E on this little sheet here, and you'll see, okay, E was my 1. It's in the 1 column, okay? Oh, and then I did a 4A. That's in the 4 column, right? And then a 5, right, is a B, which is the 5 chord there. And then I go all the way back to the root. So there's a lot of ways to understand this, and I don't want to mean this to be just a shortcut, but remember, we're starting to look for patterns so that we can train smart. We're not just playing a chord progression. Start looking for what is a familiar sound that can fall into some of these patterns. So a 1-4-5-1. That's what that means when you hear that. A 1, 4, 5, 1 in the key of E. So we go to this chart. Okay, that's going to be an E, an A, a B, and back to E. And then we went to exercise 2. And in exercise 2, we had D, major 7, G, A, and D. So now let's go to our D, right? So go to the D column here, the D row. And we can see, okay, so we were playing a D was our 1 chord. The G is the 4. A is the 5 chord. And then back to D as the 1, right? What's really important about this is that this really forms the foundation of music. And at first, when you get started, everything feels brand new. Everything looks random. And you watch a guitar player flying all over the fretboard, and it just looks like completely random. But all of those are just, it's a demonstration of familiar territory, right? So this is sort of a first initial way to see how that familiar territory is built when you're playing a song, right? So from D, G, A, D, I started with a D major 7 just to give a little bit of color, but it still doesn't change the quality of that chord. It's still a major chord there. So what we have beneath that now, if we look at this sheet, says the order of sharps and flats. The key of C is just neutral. It has no sharps and flats. The key of G has 1 sharp. The key of D has 2 sharps. And you'll notice it goes from 0 sharps, and as the sheet goes all the way down, it ends with 7 sharps on each of them. So when we go 7 sharps on each of them, that gets us to C sharp, right? And you can play in C sharp if you like. There's a lot of, different piano tunes that'll be in that, but that's a little bit less common in guitar unless you have a capo. But if somebody were to say a 1, 4, 5 in C sharp, you can do the math. You could get overwhelmed and think, I don't know what to do. Just use this as a quick reference guide and say, okay, I do know, right? I play a C sharp major. I play an F sharp major because I'm going to my 4 column. Play a G sharp major, go to my 5 column, and go back to C sharp. Boom, got it. Now, figuring out where to play that on the fretboard, that's where we talked last week about the bar chords, right? So in playing these chord progressions, sometimes you'll have to have a bar chord, and sometimes you have to experiment with where each of these chords are found. But again, that's the last part. The first part is knowing what that means, a 1, 4, 5 in any of those keys. So this says order of sharps and flats. That just means as we go, the key of G has 1 sharp. What sharp is that going to be? It's going to be an F. The key of D has 2 sharps. That's going to be F and C. So I just learned this from music theory class back in high school. The order of the sharps was fat cows go down and eat beans. Very, very profound. You can come up with whatever silly or profound sentence like that you would like. It doesn't matter as long as it sticks. For some reason, that one never left, so I keep that. But again, that's another reference thing as well. And at the bottom of the sheet, you'll notice we have the recipe that makes up chords and what the intervals are, right? This is another one. So if you come across, okay, a minor chord, how's a minor chord spelled? This is just a quick reference for you to have. There's a lot of information on here, and I don't want this to overwhelm you, but I also want you to see the value of having information like this in one place. So it keeps it from being this abstract, confusing thing and makes it just a little bit more concrete, all right? So from there, what I want to do is actually go into our next exercise. And I just want to talk about, before we get to that, so we have we did our 1, 4, 5, 1. And now let's start looking at some other common variations of that. A really common progression is going to be a 1, 5, 6, 4. So, for example, if we look all the way at exercise number 3, we have an E, we have a B, we have a C sharp minor, and an A. So if you hear that term 1, 5, 6, 4, again, you can reference this, right? But now, once you reference it and play it, you want to start attaching the sound of that so that when you're practicing, when you're in your training, you have a good big picture of what's happening. So what we're doing here is we have an E, right? And then I go to this version of a B, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then I have this different version of playing a C sharp minor, and then I go to this A. Now these are just colorful versions, but I'm still following the same exact outline and principles that we talked about on this sheet with forming our chords. So you'll notice, okay, we're in the key of E, so our E is our 1 chord, and then I'm going from there to a B, which is our 5, and those are both major, and then I get to the 6th chord, a C sharp. Because the 6th chord is minor, I just make sure that that's a C sharp minor, and then I go to A 1 5 6 4. And if you look up on YouTube the 1 5 6 4, sometimes they have, like, 1,000 songs in 4 minutes using this, and they'll play 10 seconds from each, and you're like, oh, okay, those are really helpful. They're funny, but they're also really helpful for you to start to see, oh my gosh, okay, this pattern is found everywhere. So to start, let's go to our E. We already know that one. Now I'm going to go to a B. So let's look at that. Exercise number 3 on the tab there. We have our E and then we have the B. If you'll notice, I have an X on the low E string. And the reason why is because you can either avoid playing it or you can sort of mute it with the first finger. We talked about that last week. Some chords will require that. But we have this here, and then we want to go your first finger on the A on the second fret, and then the D, your 3rd finger, and then the B, right? The 4th finger there, and then we have open. It's kind of a B suspended chord, but it works as a B. You can use this just as your B. So we have E, we have this B, and then we go all the way up for a C sharp minor, and I like this one because it has just a nice color to it. And again, that's one of the best things to train on, is finding chords that are really pleasing, progressions and exercises that are fun to listen to, make it easier to practice. So now with this one, you're going to take your 2nd finger all the way up on the 9th fret, and then you just mute the next one with your 2nd finger. Don't put too much effort into thinking about muting that, because if you do, you might end up pressing it accidentally. Just think about a little bit of the skin of the middle finger sort of bumping into the range of the A string. Okay, and now we have our 3rd finger is on the 9th fret of the D, and then 1st finger is on the 8th fret of the G, and then we have these open B and E strings. This is our C sharp minor, which is going to be our minor 6 chord. So again, when you hear that 1 5 6 4, start to think about that. That same sound we can put in multiple keys, and that's what we're going to do here. And then from there, we're going to go back to the A that we know so well, that we just did before. So again, from E, that's our 1st chord. And we're going to a different B than we did before. And then all the way up to our C sharp minor. And then from there down to here. Okay? So now let's try this at 60 beats per minute. Ready? Oh, my microphone is falling. Okay. Mute to the audio just for a second. Sorry. Perfect. Thanks for coming today. Okay, ready? Here we go. 60 beats per minute. We'll start on E. 1, 2, ready, go. To B. To C sharp minor. To A. To E. To B. C sharp minor. B, C sharp minor, to A, to E, last time, Excellent. So now when we get to exercise 4, What I want you to notice is that this is the exact same progression, but we're putting it in a different key. So we're saying D, that's our 1 chord, so we go back to our reference sheet here. D is our 1 chord, and then we go from there to A, which is our 5, and then a B is a 6 chord, so we want to do B minor, and then we want to go to G as the 4th chord. So let's try that real quick, just so you can see how you can get the same sound all over. So we're not just saying the progression is D, D, A, B minor, G. We're actually saying it's a 1, 5, 6, 4. Because if you go to another key, that formula stays the same. So it's important to know the formula, not just the chords that you're playing. So the D is going to remain, that's an easy one, and then A. And this is a different way of doing a B minor, where you sort of do a little bit of a D, and then put your first finger all the way down here. All right, your first finger is going to go on the A string on the B. That's your B note, but the A string on the 2nd fret. And then you have a D, and then your second finger is going to go on the G on the 2nd fret. Third finger up here on the B, and then all the way that right on the high E there. And that gives you a nice version of a B minor that, you can play the bar chord version, but this is a nice colorful way. And then we end on G. So let's play through that real quick, and then we'll take a couple of questions, see how you guys are feeling so far. So a 1, 5, 6, 4. Now we're transplanting that from E, and we're going to go into A. So let's look at exercise 4. 1, 2, ready, go. A, B minor, to G, to D, to A, to B minor, to G, D, to A, to B minor, to G. One more time. To D, to A, to B minor, to G. And you'll notice for that B minor, I sometimes substituted this one with going like this. And here's a situation again, if you want to sort of look for a colorful version that's not a bar chord, you lift the bar and see what open string is available. That gives you that nice warm chord there. So that's what that is. So we have the 1, 5, 6, 4 in those two. So, hopefully you guys are okay tracking with me. Let's take some questions here. All right. Can you comment on the angle you hold the guitar? I noticed that I hold it very horizontal and better. Better players usually seem to hold it more of a 45-degree angle. That's a really good question because I remember really fighting with certain chords and not realizing, in the same way that I was fighting with the guitar neck to play certain chords, I also didn't realize that there's certain angles of the neck that really work against how your hands are naturally made. If you have the guitar more of a straight position like this, most of the time we sit down with the guitar on one knee, right? Plant the elbow, right, on your other knee, and then just sort of go for it. The problem with that is it really is it's sort of like trying to throw a ball with only your elbow, right? You're sort of limiting your reach. Like, you can do it a little bit. You can get some of those chords, but you're really straining, and you might not realize it. And that's a tricky thing because maybe straining becomes more familiar, but it's not necessarily more efficient. So you have to always analyze that with your guitar positioning. Am I comfortable? Am I straining? And be honest about that. And if you go to a different position, is it not workable because it's too difficult, right? If this position, or is it just unfamiliar? And that's a really important question to ask. So I tend to like to have the neck pointed up a little bit because it feels like my wrist naturally goes there. Whereas if I have the neck this way, that makes it a little bit harder for me to reach. And I feel like once I was getting all the way up to like my C major chord, sometimes what would happen is I would just like mute the high E string, and I felt like it required a whole lot more pressure. And then that gets compounded into the next, and also you start elbowing yourself in the stomach, and you're like, guitar playing should be fun. It is. Just move it, right? Just move your position. Sometimes standing up, sometimes sitting down. So for me, my comment on this is a little bit up, and I just wear a strap. Sometimes you can get a footrest or something to help with that. But I find that it makes it a whole lot easier to have the neck angled up a little bit. Awesome. Hope that answered your question. Now the next question is, was it hard to get used to playing a guitar without fret markers? This is an optical illusion because I have fret markers here. This makes me look really smart, doesn't it? Wow, how does he know where to go? Well, I do actually have the fret markers here, so I'm cheating. I pulled back the curtain. You got me, But yes, on this side, that does make it harder for you. It makes it harder for me to teach because if I say 5th fret and you don't see sort of a dot there. So some guitars, I've sat down with some old classical guitars and they'll have like the only thing labeled will be like the 12th fret. And man, I'm just lost. There's no GPS. There's no road signs. I have no idea where to go. So if you find one of those guitars, and I did have one at some point, I don't now, I just took a marker, like one of those silver markers, and I just colored on at least the fret edge, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7, 9, and 12. So if you have a guitar like that, just color. It's okay. You can probably erase it off later, or you can polish or buff it off. But for me, yes, I do have them on this side of the neck, but not on this side. I hope that clears it up. All right. So what I want to do. We have a few more minutes left. I want to sort of tackle what's happening on the second sheet of our exercises here. If we look at exercise 5, this is another common progression. Instead of now, up to this point, we've done a 1, 4, 5, 1 formula. We see how that sound is very familiar. We also have a 1, 5, 6, 4, and we realize that's found in so many different songs. This one is going to be a minor 2, 5, 1, and then a minor 6. Sometimes you'll hear in jazz lingo when they talk about, it's a 2-5-1, man, it's just a 2-5-1, just 2-5-1. It can be like, okay, what? And the 2-5-1, when jazz players are talking about a 2-5-1, can mean a whole lot of different things. Because it may not be in a specific key. They could be grabbing a 2 from one chord, a 5 from another, and it can get pretty complex pretty easily. But it's still a very common foundational concept. I like to put a 6 chord at the end of it just to sort of fill out the rest of the progression. But 2, 5, 1, minor 6, right? So what we'll do here is we actually look, if we look at exercise 5, this is going to be an F sharp minor, a B, an E, and a C sharp minor. So what I want to do with this one is our F sharp minor, we'll find a little bit of an easier way to do that. Take your second finger, put it on the low string on the 2nd fret, and we have the A, and then you have your 3rd finger here on the D string, and then on the G, the second fret, and then these are open, and this is a version of an F sharp minor. So there's our 2. If this is an F sharp minor, again, we refer back to our sheet here, right? So our master sheet, the F sharp is going to be a minor. So this is telling us if our F sharp is in as our 2 chord, that's going to be in the key of E. So we have an F sharp minor, then we're going to go to a B, right? 2, 5, and then 1, E major, and then we're going to go to a minor 6, would be a C sharp minor there. Okay, so we have the F sharp minor. We have this new B that we did before. We have an E, so there's our 1. Then we're going all the way up to that C sharp minor that we did before. Right? So far we have... So again, we're practicing this and we're going to run this together, but this is not just about repetition. Start listening to how it feels. When you have, for me, the 2-5-1-6 or 2-5-1 or a 1-4-5, each of them have a specific color or sort of even a tune I can attach to them. If I play a 1-5-6-4, I tend to think Let It Be from the Beatles, right? The 2-5-1, there's a long list of old jazz standards that kind of go through my mind. It's important to grab the concept and make it as personal as possible, as quick as possible, because then not only do you internalize it, you know how to use it, and you can reference that sound. Okay, so let's try this. We're going to do number 5. We'll start with our F sharp minor at 60 beats per minute. 1, 2, F sharp minor, go. All the way up to C sharp minor, F sharp minor, sharp minor, back to F sharp minor again, to B, to E, to C sharp minor. Let's try one more time. To B, C sharp minor. Excellent. So now let's look closely at the next one in exercise 6. In exercise 6, we have an E minor, then we're going to an A, and we have a D and a B minor. All right? So what we're doing here is we're going to be playing basically in the key of D. Our E minor is going to be our 2, and then we have our A, which is our 5, and then you have our 1 chord, 2-5-1, and then a minor 6, right, is going to be our B minor. So we're taking the same one and now transplanting that into a new key. So let's try this. We're playing an E minor, and all I'm going to do is just add, again, we talked about finding a local color tone in every chord that you play. I tend to like to put this, if I'm playing an E minor, and I just put this up so the D string goes on the 4th fret. Makes a nice, ooh, that E minor became even more minor and glorious. And then I go to just a standard A, then we go to D, and then to this B minor that we did already. So let's run through that together. We'll do 60 beats per minute. E minor, our new E minor, or you can do the standard E minor, A, D, B minor. And that's our 2-5-1-6. 1, 2, ready, go. To A, to B minor, to E minor, to A, to D, to B minor, to E minor, to A, to D, B minor, and on E minor. And again, if you find any of these tricky, remember you have the PDF and the Guitar Pro. You can go through those and find those chord changes. What I want to do is just end, and I'll one more thing, one more slight variation on what we've done so far. And then we'll take some questions. And the whole idea of this is to zoom in each week on a specific concept and then really get some of the internal workings of how it's going, then zooming back out, and then the next week we do something different. Next week we'll talk about rhythm and strum patterns specifically. You've noticed that the first week and this week we've done just really straight strumming. But then we're going to get into understanding how rhythm works next week. Then we have scales, arpeggios, playing a solo, playing with expression. Each week really highlights a good thing to focus on when you're training, right? Smart. We want to train smart. We need the tools, not just the passion, right? So what's interesting about exercise 7 and 8, all I want to do is we're sort of playing with expectations here, meaning if you have a 1, 4, 5, sometimes just changing what should be a major to a minor, or changing what should be a minor to a major in a key, can yield some really interesting results. So for instance, exercise 7 is a 1, 6, 5, and then I go, I'm sorry, a 1, 6, 5, and then I do a minor 4, right? So I have a D, a B minor there, a G, and then a G minor. Because this G is our 4 chord, I'm going from a 4 chord that should be major and I'm making it minor. And that's where you start to hear, this happens a lot in the 1950s. Right? And this version of a G minor, and again, if you don't want to play the bar chord version, you can still get a really good G minor here, putting your second finger on the low E, and then on the D string, and then you that's open, and then you have your third finger on the G, on the 3rd fret, and then your 4th finger on the 3rd fret on the B. And you get this really interesting minor chord sound there. So that's what's happening in this exercise. We have the D to a B minor to a G. And I say playing with expectations because we've arrived at G. It's a very familiar sound. We have our 1, we go to the 6th chord, now we have this, we have our 4, and now making it minor. It feels like it's arrived, it feels like it's resolved, but there's something different and unique about it. And that's what you want to start listening to. The Beatles did this a lot, and so much stuff from the 1950s did that as well. Right? And the last one, in exercise 8, now it's doing something a little bit different. So we had a 2, this one will be a 2, 4, 1, 6. So I'm kind of taking some different combinations from each of these. But instead of the 2 chord being a minor chord, I'm making it major. Right? And I'm doing this in the key of E. So I have, instead of an F sharp minor to A, to E, to B minor, if I make that 2 chord a major, it does feel like it's a 2 chord, but there's something different about it. And that's what really interesting songwriting does. It plays with your expectations. It's what you want to hear, but it's a totally different way of hearing it, you know? So instead of, now I have into E, then to, sorry, this says B minor. This should be a C sharp minor in the tab. Sorry for the misspelling there. So we have, back to the, all right, let's try this real quick. Start with your first finger on the 2nd fret of the E, 3rd finger on the A string, and then your 4th finger right there on the D, and then on the G, put your 2nd finger. Right? Then we go all the way up to the 5th chord, or the 5th fret there, then back to E, and then up to, this should be a C sharp minor. It says B minor there. It's a mistake there. So let's try this at 60 beats per minute. 1, 2, ready, go. C sharp minor, F sharp major to A, to E, to B minor. Sorry, C sharp minor. I keep written it as B minor. F sharp to A, to E, and on C sharp minor. Okay, so the overall idea here and the way to really implement this is kind of like the why. Why are we doing this? Just use this kind of reference sheet, and what you want to do is just try a couple of different patterns. You can try a 4-5-1-2, a 3-5, 3-6-1-4. Just come up, even like literally write out different series of combinations. There's a lot of common ones that you'll notice will emerge, and you'll say, okay, this is why this makes sense, because it really naturally goes from one chord to the next. But don't worry about that as much as just getting a handle on what is being communicated when you hear that 1-4-5. I have a sheet that is we have some sharp keys, and then there's a secondary sheet that is for flat keys. So you can keep both of those up, and when you come across them, you reference them and you know exactly what to do. All right. So let's go to some questions. Hopefully you guys are hanging in with me here. When you switch chords, do you hit all of the notes for the next chord at the same time? Good question. It depends on the chord. What I tend to, there's a lot of guitar players that will actually, like if you switch chords, you hit all of the notes for the next chord at the same time. I try to make sure that if I'm going to go, let's say for example, on the 2nd fret here on this chord, to get to the next chord, I usually try to get into the shape of that chord before I press any first note down. This is when I'm working on not just playing the chord, but playing it in a sequence. This is when I do this. When you're just learning to play the chord, it's okay. You want to get everything in a row, make sure everything's ringing clean, and then just take that exact shape and don't let your fingers reset and then come back. What you want to do is keep it in the exact shape of the chord, lift it off like 1 centimeter, and then come right back down. Lift it off, come right back down, without letting your fingers go like this. If you have your arm really far down with the guitar this way, the only way for the fingers to leave the fretboard is to reset, right? But why this is important is now I'm not thinking from going to this one to this. I'm thinking in terms of getting ready for the entire shape. Now it just happens in this example that this is the exact same shape here that I'm moving up to here, but the principle still applies. You don't just reshuffle the fingers. You want to make sure you morph into the overall shape before you put them down. And so as best you can, not every chord this will work for, but a general rule, a general tip is to make sure that you press everything down at the same time and memorize that block, the way that that chord feels. So it's not 4 individual units, it's all of them working together to form this chord. And from there, it's a whole lot easier to memorize, to get quicker, and to get more confident at playing from chord to chord, right? So I hope that answers your question. So I hope you will join me next week for the guitar gym. For rookies, there's so much information all over the internet, and I hope that I can sort of narrow it down into a concept each week, into a couple of chunks that help make sense. That's the important thing. So remember, as Mickey says, you got the heart, but you ain't got the tools. We want the tools because the heart, man, guitar players have enough passion. We have more passion than anybody in the world. But making sure that we really are smart about what we're practicing on all of these given topics, that's the real important thing. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Bye.